A single peppercorn, a silk thread, or a lump of coal, they've caused more wars, built more empires, and moved more people than almost any ideology in history. For nearly every student I've taught over the years, history feels like a series of dates. But if you look closer, history is actually a series of transactions. Today, we are asking a question that College Board loves. To what extent was trade the most important development in human history? We're going to look at this through the lens of each course, AP World, AP Euro, and APUSH. Because if you can argue that trade was the engine behind religion, war, and revolution, you aren't just passing the exam, you're mastering the complexity point. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items, as I like to call them in the classroom. First, have you signed up for the DBQ class yet? The link is in the show notes. This is a 5-session course that I teach on a platform called OutSchool. I will walk you through every point of the rubric, what it is, how to earn it, what it looks like. I will give you specific examples, and we will look at exemplars, people who have done it right, and what that looks like. Then you'll have the opportunity to practice with my guidance and individualized feedback. Now, teachers who listen, if you're interested, let me know, and maybe I will put together a teacher course as just like on OutSchool, but OutSchool doesn't allow adults, but maybe I'll put something together for teachers. Next, based on advice I got while attending PodFest from one of my podcast platform reps, I've started a new YouTube channel. Now, you'll still be able to listen to or watch the full podcast video on the AP History Help channel, but I'm migrating my shorts over to a new channel called AP History Help Shorts. Apparently, it's better for the algorithm to have separate channels for full-length videos as compared to short videos. The point being that I encourage you to find both and follow me, AP History Help and AP History Help Shorts. And I try to post on Shorts every day. And the podcast channel will also have other longer form videos on it. Many more to come in the future, but also there's some from the past. Come on in, students, and take your seats. I'm Wendy, and this is AP History Help. As mentioned earlier, we are going to take a deep dive into the world of trade and try to answer the question, to what extent is trade the most important development in history? Now, let's start with a little AP World. If you look at Unit 2, this is the trade unit, right? You see the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean trade, and the Trans-Saharan trade. If trade didn't exist, would Buddhism have even left India? Would Islam have reached Indonesia? Probably not. Now, just to elaborate a little bit on this, Buddhism's expansion from South Asia into East Asia was a product of the Silk Road. For merchants who were traversing the dangerous routes between India and China, Buddhism offered a universalist message that transcended local ethnic boundaries and provided a moral framework for how they behaved in foreign lands. Buddhist monasteries became vital infrastructure for these traders. They served as hostels, banks, and supply depots. In exchange for protection and logistics, wealthy merchants became the primary patrons of Buddhist faith, funding the creation of a massive group of cave temples and stupas along the route. Now, over time, the religion evolved into Mahayana Buddhism, which emphasized the role of the bodhisattvas. a compassionate group of beings who helped others achieve enlightenment, a concept that resonated deeply with the arduous and uncertain lives of the travelers. Now, similarly, the spread of Islam into West Africa and Southeast Asia was driven by the merchant scholar model. In the trans-Saharan trade, Muslim merchants from North Africa introduced the faith to West African kingdoms like Ghana and Mali. For local rulers, converting to Islam facilitated trust and better credit terms with Arab trading partners and provided access to a literate class of administrators. In the Indian Ocean, Muslim traders settled in diasporic communities along the Swahili coast and the Indonesian archipelago. And because Islam provided a unified legal system, Sharia law, and a common language of Arabic, it created a stable environment for international commerce. Unlike the earlier conquests in the Middle East, these regions adopted Islam voluntarily, often blending it with local traditions to create unique syncretic cultures. Trade routes are effective for religious diffusion because they involve long-term repeated contact between people. Religion often traveled as cultural baggage, the ideas, the rituals, the languages that merchants brought with them. Because successful trade requires mutual trust and shared values, a common religion served as the ultimate contract, allowing a merchant in Cairo to do business with a merchant in Malacca under a shared set of ethics and expectations. In AP world, trade is the primary vehicle for cultural diffusion. It's not just about the silk or the spices. It's about the things that the merchants brought with them. They brought the Black Death, they brought gunpowder, and they brought the printing press. And just consider the implications of each of those. Without the Indian Ocean Trade Network, your favorite food would not exist where they do today. And global distribution of religion, it would look completely different. Now, in your DBQs, use trade for the cause of the spread of belief systems. That is your evidence for continuity and change. Now let's pivot to AP Euro. To what extent was trade the most important development here? Well, think about the commercial revolution. This represented a fundamental shift from the localized, subsistence-based manorial economies of the Middle Ages to a more global capitalistic system. This transition was fueled by the Age of Discovery and the opening of new trade routes in the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, which moved the center of economic power away from the Mediterranean and toward Western European nations like Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and England. Key innovations of this era included the development of sophisticated banking institutions, marine insurance, and joint stock companies, such as the Dutch East India Company, which also allowed investors to pool capital and share risks of long-distance voyages. The period also witnessed the price revolution, a time of significant inflation driven by an influx of silver and gold from the Americas alongside a rising population. This economic transformation is essential for understanding the rise of the influential middle class, known as the bourgeoisie, and the establishment of the financial infrastructure that would eventually support the Industrial Revolution. And by the way, the bourgeoisie weren't nobles with titles. They were people with ships. So this trade drove mercantilism, which in turn led to the absolute monarchies of Unit 3 needing to fund the massive navies to protect their favorable balance of trade. Why care? Because the very concept of the modern state and the capitalist system you likely live in was born from the competition for spices and gold. In an LEQ, trade is your best evidence for how Europe moved from feudalism to modernity. All right, ready? Time for our episode 55 fun fact. I love the alliteration on that one. And this one bridges all three of the courses, so nobody tune out on this. In the 1600s, the Dutch and the English were obsessed with a tiny remote island in Indonesia called Run, R-U-N, Run. Why? Because it was covered in nutmeg trees. And at the time, nutmeg was worth its weight in gold. They fought a brutal war over this one tiny speck of land that was 3 kilometers by 1 kilometer, right? Tiny. Now, eventually, they signed a treaty to end the fighting. The Dutch got the island of Run, and in exchange, the English got a worthless little muddy island in North America called Manhattan. The Dutch thought they won the jackpot because they're like, hey, we got a monopoly on nutmeg. The English got a swamp that became New York City. Man, history has a funny way of balancing the books, doesn't it? Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about APUSH. Now, in the APUSH curriculum, trade is often the root cause of our greatest conflicts. In Unit 2, the triangle trade wasn't just an economic system. It was the foundation of the brutal system of chattel slavery that defined American history for centuries. Trade didn't just move goods. It moved people as property. Later in Unit 4 is the market revolution. Market, right? Like that's like another word for a place to trade. So this was the mid-19th century transformation that shifted the U.S. from being a subsistence-based local economy to a connected national commercial market. This wasn't just about one invention. It was a perfect storm of the transportation revolution led by the Erie Canal and the steamboats and the early railroads, which all existed for trade, and the communication revolution sparked by the telegraph. For the first time, regional specialization became possible. The Midwest became the nation's breadbasket, the Northeast its industrial heart, and the South its cotton producer. This economic web created a new sense of national identity, but it also reshaped the American home. As production moved from the hearth to the factory, it gave birth to the cult of domesticity and the rise of a distinct middle class. For your exam, remember, the market revolution is the why behind nearly every social reform movement and political conflict of the antebellum era. This trade-led connectivity is what built the canals and the railroads, but it also fueled the sectionalism that led to the Civil War. Now, to understand how the global trade networks of the 19th century, the very ones that built the first age of globalization, were turned into weapons that tore the world apart, you have to look at the shift from interdependence to vulnerability. In the lead up to the world wars, this breakdown happened in 3 distinct ways. First, the weaponization of the supply chain. By 1914, European nations were more interconnected than ever before. However, this interdependence became a fatal weakness during the war. Britain used its naval supremacy to implement a total blockade of Germany, effectively choking off the trade networks that supplied the German people with food and raw materials. Germany responded with unrestricted submarine warfare, using U-boats to sink merchant vessels in the Atlantic. The same shipping lanes that once brought prosperity were transformed into killing zones, turning global commerce into a tool of starvation and attrition. Second, imperialism as an economic zero-sum game. The trade networks established during the new imperialism of the late 19th century created intense friction between the great powers. As nations competed for exclusive access to markets and raw materials in Africa and Asia, trade was no longer seen as a mutual benefit, but as a zero-sum game. The Moroccan crises and the competition for the place in the sun showed that nations were willing to risk global war to protect their specific trade interests. The networks didn't just move goods. They moved national egos and military assets into direct confrontation. And third, the collapse of the gold standard and the rise of protectionism. So as the wars progressed, the stable financial networks that allowed for easy international trade collapsed. Governments abandoned the gold standard to print money for the war effort, leading to hyperinflation and economic instability. And following the wars, instead of returning to open trade, nations retreated into protectionism and trade wars, raising tariffs like the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the US to protect domestic industries. Balkanization destroyed the trust required for global trade and helped fuel the rise of extremist ideologies that led directly to the next conflict. Now, why does all this fit the complexity point? For AP Euro and world history essays, even APUSH, I'd say, this is a perfect example of causation and change over time. You can argue that the Industrial Revolution created a world so tightly wound together by trade that when the first thread was pulled in 1914, the entire fabric of global society unraveled with unprecedented speed and violence. The machine of progress simply became a machine of destruction. So back to our big question. Don't ever forget that prompt. To what extent was trade the most important development? Now, if you get a prompt about social change or political power, you almost always use trade as your primary driver. It's the why behind the what. Trade is the ultimate complexity tool. If the prompt asks about the spread of Islam, you talk about trade. If the prompt asks about the rise of the British Empire, you talk about trade. It shows the grader, the reader, the person who's grading your paper, that you understand just how interconnected the world really is. You guys, history is not just a list of names and dates. It's a collection of receipts. If you're feeling overwhelmed by all of this, don't forget to use that student success planner for the weekly entry. You can take notes about trade as an economic development to help you categorize these facts by course, and you see the bigger picture. Next episode, we are jumping back into the AP Euro curriculum. The year is really winding down, isn't it? Unit 7 is about 19th century perspectives and political developments that lead us right up to the causes of the world wars. AP World, APUSH students, I haven't forgotten about you. I gave you all love last year. I covered your curriculum. And so if you just search on whichever course and unit you're looking for on your podcast player or on YouTube, when you're on the AP History Help channel, you'll find AP World and APUSH, whatever unit. I promise. And if you have problems, message me. I will help you. I will send you the direct link to whatever platform you want it on, within reason. So speaking of which, please give me a follow on your favorite platform. And if you get value from this episode, give it a like, give it a review, comment and say something nice about how much you enjoy the podcast, or comment a question that you might have, or even a possible future deep dive topic that, like we've been doing with trade and women in history. I would be incredibly grateful. It means so much to me when I get thumbs up and kudos from my students, from their parents, from my listeners and my viewers. And for those of you who are still listening, I've got a secret. I don't know if I should tell you because then I feel like I have to do it. Let me know what you think about what I'm about to tell you, but I'm thinking about going weekly with the podcast. That's right, releasing new episodes, every Monday during the school year. It's a lot of work, but I also feel like I get disconnected from you going every other week. So let me know what you think in the comments or send me a message. And with that, this episode of the AP History Help podcast is now history.